The revolution's begun. The time to stand up has come. We are the rocking of the throne. We are the rocking of the throne.
Hello, my name is Victor Tiffany. I'm the co-founder of Revolt Against Plutocracy, and I have a special guest with me tonight. During the primaries last year, he was dubbed the full-throated avatar of the Bernie or Bust movement. H.A. Goodman, thank you for joining me for a conversation tonight.
Thank you for having me here, Victor. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You got my attention with something you said recently in a monologue, and I want to come back to that. But first, in late 2014, you had written a column on Huffington Post that you were going to endorse and support and end up voting for Rand Paul unless he chose Mike Huckabee as a running mate. And then Bernie announced you came around to Bernie, and indeed, without ever having a conversation with us, I've never talked to you before till just now. So without any kind of coordination, you really did follow along or help lead the conversation about Bernie or Bust. You did become Bernie or Bust, and then ultimately, when we dropped the write-in idea because it was turned out to be pretty stupid, and endorsed Jill Stein as the or bust option, you came right along with all that. So explain to viewers how you made that transition from Rand to Bernie to Jill Stein.
All right. So basically, this is what took place. Before I wrote that article on Rand Paul, I wrote an article stating Elizabeth Warren, not Hillary Clinton, should be the first female president of the United States. So that I wanted initially Elizabeth Warren. I wrote articles about Jim Webb. I wrote about others aside from Rand Paul. The reason that I wrote the Rand Paul article was at that point, first of all, a lot of kind of the identity politics, Democrat / I'm with her cult, they saw that as blasphemy. And they don't, because they don't really put neoconservative foreign policy as something that they view as a threat to humanity or a threat to the country. They would never vote for a pro-life Democrat. I would never vote for a neocon Democrat. I would not. So when I wrote that article, it was purely from an anti-war, anti-perpetual war, anti-regime change vantage point that I thought would resonate even with the I'm with her crowd or even with the loyal Clinton Democrats. What took place was a lot of people misinterpreted that and said I was a libertarian. Of course, there's a lot of value system that libertarians and progressives have. For example, we don't want perpetual wars. We don't want mass surveillance. So civil liberties and the issue of peace are very important to progressives, libertarians. Generally, that's historically a progressive issue. Unfortunately, Democrats have swallowed up any anti-war movement in the country. So when I wrote that article, it was from the vantage point of somebody who would love to have had Elizabeth Warren at that point. When Bernie Sanders came into the picture, he encompassed everything that I want: banning fracking, implementing single payer, breaking up too big to fail banks, reinstating Glass-Steagall, and then also ending perpetual quagmires where half to 2/3 of all the Americans killed and wounded were the victims of IED blasts. So that also coincided with when President Obama was sending Americans back to Iraq and keeping them forever in Afghanistan, even though he promised not to do that in 2008. So that was it was more of a statement than a wholehearted endorsement. But that never came to fruition. It was never Rand Paul versus Hillary Clinton. So that's essentially what what kind of the background is with that. So that's where I was coming from. It was more of an anti-war statement than me wanting to just cut social services and all that. That I didn't want, but.
That's it's interesting you bring that up, because it's something you said recently in a monologue that I happened to catch. You were sort of considering whether you're a progressive or something else, and you referenced very directly that you're anti-war. And it got me thinking, well, that makes sense. That's how you would initially go for someone like Rand Paul, and certainly reject someone like Hillary Clinton, and then end up with someone like Jill Stein. And it got me thinking even further, this whole business of anti-war. Is there an anti-war ideology? There's a just war ideology.
Yeah.
And if you look at ideologies, right, they're basically premised upon political economy, from the Marxist on the left or the anarchist on the left all the way over to the libertarians on the right, with neoliberals and conservatives and so forth in between. But there's no peace ideology other than pacifism. Are you a pacifist?
Well, no, I'm not a pacifist, but I just don't. My vantage point is, if you look at President Obama and President Bush and now President Trump, and you compare their foreign policies, well, let's just say Obama and Bush, because we've seen the body of work. You compare their foreign policy to Reagan, which used to be considered a hawk compared to, and this was right after Vietnam. He was a hawk. He was to the right in terms of foreign policy. And I'm not saying that, I'm not promoting Reagan's foreign policy. I'm just saying in the context of U.S. history, we've become more militant. Even the Democratic Party has actually morphed into the Republican Party on foreign policy. Reagan never implemented regime changes like Iraq, Afghanistan, send soldiers to Syria. After the Beirut bombing, he left Beirut. So it was a completely different paradigm then, because we learned from Vietnam that regime change, especially within a civil war type of setting where you have two different opposing sides and the United States is in the middle, that doesn't work for the U.S. Counterinsurgency wars, the greater power, whether it's the Soviet Union or the French in Indochina or us and Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, it just doesn't work because there's so many different factions within another country that has a different culture that we just don't want. There's no way to convince or control the hearts and minds of people when bombs are involved, and we are trying through force to overthrow a government. So my vantage point is, I'm not a pacifist, but I don't see the utility. It's counterproductive from a moral sense of sending our soldiers to these places where they fight IEDs. That's the biggest, and they're caught in between insurgents and a civil war. And then when you look at the repercussions, the human toll of our foreign policy, that's always, to help others. It's always marketed as we're helping others. By one estimate, 500,000 people died in Iraq. We completely destabilized the Middle East. That spilled into Syria. If we really cared about peace in Syria, the Russians and the United Nations offered some kind of peace deal, different types of peace deals in 2013 that President Obama and Clinton completely ignored because it didn't entail Assad leaving. So they're just, I'm kind of all over the place with the answer, but in a nutshell, to summarize, I'm not necessarily pacifist because I understand there are certain times where some wars you could say are justified. The majority of military interventions that we engage in are done under the pretext of either helping others or helping the world. And what takes place is we cause more havoc, chaos. Libya is an example under President Obama and Clinton. And then, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan. The Middle East is in flames right now. We have ISIS, we have Al-Qaeda all over the place, well, ISIS all over the place because we destabilize these countries. And that's why.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but Obama famously or infamously dropped in excess of 26,000 bombs in that area last year. Just focusing on that alone, how does that improve our national security, or does it improve our national security? Does it, in fact, create a situation where relatives of 26,000 or 50,000 or however many people died in those attacks now consider the United States an enemy that they might be plotting every day to somehow attack in order to get revenge.
Absolutely. No, you brought up a great point, Victor. That is the unintended slash, we're doing it almost on purpose because we know better. And this is also the problem. One of the reasons I initially wrote that Rand Paul article is that you don't want both political parties to merge into one on a war and foreign policy. If you do, then you have unmitigated militarism. You have this unmitigated type of thing where we are more outraged. So I don't like Trump's immigrant ban, but we're more outraged that immigrants can't come to the country than actually bombing these countries where these immigrants live. So we create the immigrant crisis or the refugee crisis. We create it by destabilizing nations in the Middle East. Then when they can't come, and then Trump does something, for example, that I don't like, there's more outrage on the left, quote unquote left, in America about an immigrant ban than us accidentally bombing civilians in Syria, accidentally bombing civilians in Afghanistan, or droning people without a trial, or the repercussions of regime change, which is ISIS everywhere. There are now, it was reported that there were slave auctions in Libya. So, and we went into Libya for humanitarian, quote unquote, humanitarian reasons because Gaddafi was going to engage in a slaughter. There was a much bigger, exponentially bigger slaughter because we went in. So my thing is you have a Democratic Party that is completely in bed with the Republican Party on war and foreign policy. Then you have publications that used to really speak truth to power like The Nation. Now Joan Walsh writes for The Nation. Now you have the Clinton, type person that their voice is now The Nation's voice. So publications, even the publications that used to be on the extreme left, are now almost within the middle when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, especially U.S. foreign policy when it pertains to the Democratic Party. There are Democratic neocons now. Neocons used to be a Republican thing. Now neoconservatives fundraise for Hillary Clinton and they advise her on foreign policy. So the same mistakes that Bush made and Rumsfeld and Cheney, the same mistakes that President Obama stated were horrendous, that he was going to change, those mistakes are now being doubled and tripled down with, they were with President Obama and they are now with Trump. So it's almost like we don't have a two-party system when it comes to foreign policy anymore. And that's, I think, a travesty. It's not only horrible for the United States, but it's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe for the world. So
I'm going to come back to droning people without trial or anything like that because it's important with this big push for impeachment that you see on the left. But I want to come back to that in a minute. We have a little time left. First, with respect to the Middle East, you've got the United States, which thinks of itself, or the elites think of itself as a stabilizing force in the Middle East. And I think you and I just basically agreed that it's just the opposite. It's a destabilizing force in the Middle East. Jill Stein advocated to pull out of the Middle East, completely just pull the United States out of the Middle East. Do you see that as a situation where the Sunnis and the Shias would have a regional balance of power, and it wouldn't? Do you think that would be stabilizing to come out, or would it just create chaos of a regional war of all against all with the Russia influencing and China, for that matter, influencing in its own way?
Well, it's interesting. We used to have a policy of dual containment with Saddam and Iran. So Iraq and Iran were enemies. Now we took out Saddam and regime change. We emboldened Iran, which is now a threat, an existential threat to Saudi Arabia. And so we exacerbated the tensions that existed there between Shia and Sunni. And then, of course, we created that civil war in Iraq. That wasn't the intent, but that's what took place between Sunni and Shia. So I think that the best thing we could do as a nation is not intervene, refrain from intervening militarily in the Middle East, even against ISIS. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that you should not go ahead and help a country if they ask specifically for help against ISIS. What I'm saying is the bombing, the continual bombing, the continual military intervention, sending American special forces to over 130 nations. It's not keeping the world more stable. What we're doing is our foreign policy is based on a 6-month or year-long timeline. That's it. We can only see up to a year. We don't think, well, okay, what's going to happen if we overthrow Gaddafi in Libya? What's going to happen if we send soldiers to Syria? What's going to happen if we send American ground troops to Yemen? What's going to take place if we keep soldiers in Afghanistan indefinitely, or we keep soldiers in Iraq indefinitely? Soldiers in Iraq right now, they're fighting. In Afghanistan, they're fighting. So we have these wars that are ongoing. We have two choices. We can either send more Americans and repeat the same mistakes, or pull back. And if we pulled back, the first result would be the nations within the countries within that region would have to make the necessary changes or steps to defend their own security. I think that is important.
That was come very close to Sanders' position during the campaign. He basically wanted the Arabs to fight themselves, and the Kurds. This is an Arab and Arab Kurd, now Arab Turkish problem, and his position was, let them fight it. Right? This isn't an American problem, but we've made it an American problem when immediately started dropping bombs on them because it looked like they were going to march on Baghdad and take over Iraq and all the oil fields.
Yeah, I mean, we already spent from 2003 till now in Iraq, and then from 2001 till now in Afghanistan. The Middle East is not in a better position, it's in a worse position. The Middle East is less stable. So there's nobody, and the problem is that this originated with Bush's neoconservatives, but they've become mainstream within the Democratic Party. So it's not like you have Slate or the Daily Beast or TPM or any of those publications speaking out because of an ideological or a value system against perpetual war. They would never vote for it. My whole thing now is they would never vote for a pro-life Democrat. This is what Bill Maher doesn't get. Bill Maher would never vote for a pro-life Democrat, but he has no problem voting for a neocon Democrat. He has no problem voting for a Democrat who says, yeah, we're going to send Americans or we're going to get involved with Yemen, which is what President Obama did. Before Trump, we got involved in Yemen with President Obama. So there's no outrage on the left regarding war or foreign policy leading to endless war. There's just, it's a value system, unfortunately, that's lost.
Yeah, Maher, I don't get Bill Maher. It's no secret that Hillary Clinton would have bombed. I mean, she came right out and said, I wouldn't have warned the Russians. I'd be bombing more airfields. We'd be killing Russians. We'd be at war with Russia. And Bill Maher somehow thinks, oh, well, she's so much better than Trump. I don't see that at all. I think we said this during the campaign, that Hillary Clinton was a more dangerous, reckless warmonger than Trump appeared to be. And even now, the way she describes what's going on in Syria is, I mean, what's Bill Maher possibly thinking when he says, oh, she's not evil at all? This isn't a lesser of two evil comparison. But if she were in power, we might well be engaged in a full-scale war with nuclear-armed Russia at this point. I just don't get Maher. And that doesn't even cover the stuff he doesn't begin to understand. He says, I don't know what a neoliberal disaster would be. He doesn't understand neoliberalism. He doesn't have any clue what this ideology, which is the ideology of the establishment. It's like being fish in water and not realizing we're surrounded by water. Right? Yeah. This is the ruling ideology, and you've got somebody like Bill Maher who pretends to know what he's talking about. He doesn't even know what a neoliberal disaster is. He certainly has no idea what these so-called free trade agreements coming down the pike. And I didn't want to get sidelined on free trade. We could have a whole conversation on that. But just on the issue of war and peace, I don't get a lot of these mainstream people. Now, I don't want to elaborate on that. We both hammered Bill Maher and agree that he's a tool. I want to come back to drone strikes and this whole movement. You hear it coming from now Democrat on the House floor, and of course all kinds of activists and liberals calling for Trump's impeachment, which in the book that's coming out later this year, Bernie or Bust, which by the way you're mentioned in as a reputable source of information for revolutionaries.
Thank you. I'm honored. Thank you.
Of course, and we come out against this impeachment, if only because Mike Pence would be so much worse. He's a neoliberal, right? He's going to support these stupid free trade agreements, and he's far right in terms of opposition to gay marriage and so forth. So he'd be even worse than Trump, as bad and dangerous as Trump sounds. But I want to come back to Obama. What was it, 2011? He had Anwar al-Awlaki, an American, murdered with a Hellfire missile fired from a Predator drone. No trial, no due process. Rand Paul gave a lengthy speech. I think he was filibustering on the Senate floor about that. And he mentioned, he didn't even get a show trial. He wasn't even tried in absentia. Right? Mm-hmm. This is, I don't know what Trump's doing that's a higher crime than murdering an American with no due process. I mean, we kill people in the death penalty as a matter of routine in some states, but this idea of the president having license to go out and just murder an American because he had joined the other side. There's no question al-Awlaki was a bad guy and he had joined the other side, but there's no asterisk in the Fourth or the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment. We deserve due process, and yet Obama ignored that. Went out and killed an American with no due process, and nary a word did you hear anybody mention the I word.
I know, I agree 100% with you. That's the problem. And just really quickly, Bill Maher is just an example of what you just stated. It's kind of like they don't understand that there are people like you, like me, who have a cutoff. Our cutoff is a Democrat who acts like a Bush Republican on war and foreign policy. So that's our cutoff. Other people would not vote for a pro-life Democrat. We will not vote for a Democrat who doesn't care about perpetual endless war. That's where we draw the line. I think, unfortunately, the Democratic Party and the left or progressives, I think, unfortunately, the value system or the hierarchy of values or goals or what is considered important, that's changed over time. It used to be people protesting the Vietnam War or people against perpetual wars or people against nuclear proliferation in the 80s. That was a big issue. Now it's pick a fight with Russia because Russia hacked the DNC. The WikiLeaks DNC emails we're finding out right now could almost certainly linked to Seth Rich and Seth Rich being a WikiLeaks source. Now, do we know for certain? No. But we know that Kim.com has stated that he has evidence he's willing to testify. The fact that CNN and BuzzFeed and all of them view that as blasphemy basically is my overall point. The DNC, we know, the FBI requested the DNC servers. The DNC refused, used the third party. They then say CrowdStrike said it was Russia. The CrowdStrike isn't even certain. The NSA is moderately confident. The FBI is highly confident. No one within the intelligence agencies can say with certainty. They're all different levels of confidence regarding Russian hacking. Yet our foreign policy and domestic policy is being predicated upon the belief that Russia actually did hack the election to get Trump in office. And how do they spin that? Because us knowing about the WikiLeaks DNC emails, the mere knowledge of that was a threat to national security, even though it showed massive corruption, that Bernie Sanders was cheated, that the history of this country, we were cheated of a history of President Bernie Sanders, because he would have defeated Hillary Clinton in a fair primary. So the knowledge of that is a national security threat. It's not The mentality on the left isn't, hey, let's fix this corruption so we don't have a progressive then cheated again. It's not, you don't see the Young Turks going up against the DNC and saying, championing Jared and Elizabeth Beck, who are heroes, who are going up against the DNC and saying, hey, you lied. You stated neutrality for a purpose to get our money because you knew you wouldn't even get a dime for Hillary Clinton if you said you were always going to cheat for Hillary and appoint her. So I think a lot of these issues are all interconnected. The Democratic Party is now crumbling before our eyes, in large part because it doesn't have an anti-war movement. I think that there are just people who will not vote Democrat, no matter what, to prove a point. And if it bothers, the neoliberals like Omar, they need to understand it's they who have to actually go on our side. It's not the other way around. We're willing to go ahead and risk a Trump presidency because we don't want both, or I don't want both parties to merge into one on the biggest issues.
Well, essentially they have. We were using the phrase political duopoly long before Hillary Clinton announced her bid for president. We have just a few minutes left. I want to ask you if you think the United States is an empire. And before you answer that, I just want to reference a talk by Michael Prenti. I'll put that below, both on the Facebook page and in the YouTube account when I publish this discussion on YouTube. I'll put that in the comments below because he has a great presentation and lecture about debunking the myths of empire. So just start with, do you think the United States is functioning, I don't mean identical to, say, the British Empire or the Roman Empire, but do you think it's functionally a worldwide empire?
Well, I would say so. And it definitely is not like the British Empire or the Roman Empire. But now we're actually in countries, whereas before we were influencing nations. We know from WikiLeaks and we know from just the history of the CIA and our history in overthrowing countries, whether it was Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, or even trying to influence or trying to spy on the French elections. We learned that from WikiLeaks in 2012. We even spy on our allies. So when we're not engaging in regime changes in other countries, when we're not spying on our allies, when we are not in over 150 countries throughout the world, I think that we are functioning as an empire because we have, over 30,000 soldiers in the Middle East. We don't have a state in the Middle East. The United States of America doesn't have to be everywhere at all times or the policeman of the world, and it certainly doesn't have to overthrow countries for the betterment of those people. When at the end of the day, we hurt the people we're trying to help. So, of course, it has to. All of this is tied to interests, economic interests. Oil in the Middle East, whether it's protecting allies in the Middle East or Asia. We have a whole bunch of reasons why we're all over the place 24/7. But the fact that we are points me to say that we're more of an empire than the average American thinks we are.
So it's a lot easier to deconstruct rhetorically an empire than it is to physically deconstruct, pull back the reins of an empire. Any ideas in the remaining couple of minutes of how we can get the United States, or how the United States can, through executive action, pull back? Would it be a consequence of an election with a genuine kind of nationalist running? How do you see, if you see at all, the possibility of the United States pulling back from world empire?
I think what's going to happen is it'll take place in a roundabout way. I don't see Democrats winning in 2020. I just don't. Unless it's Bernie Sanders or Nina Turner or Tulsi Gabbard. I love all three. I don't think any establishment Democrat can defeat Trump, no matter how much CNN or the Washington Post or any of them cry and yell and scream. They did the same thing and he won. So I don't see, and the Democratic Party is just as unfavorable as Trump is in terms of polls. So I just don't see a Democrat winning in 2020. I think what takes place after that, the only way for Democrats in the country to kind of get away from this perpetual counterinsurgency war / empire is for the left, or for Democrats, to actually have a viable anti-war movement. I think that only takes place when neocons or that kind of philosophy is kicked out of the party. I think that that philosophy will be kicked out of the party, hopefully, only through another election loss. Because right now, one would think, Victor, I thought that we would have a moment of self-reflection where the Democratic Party would look in the mirror and say, "Oh my God, what happened? We lost to Trump." Yeah, that didn't happen. So whenever that moment of self-reflection, and I think it'll have to do with donors, when donors stop giving the big money and they say, you know what, this is not a viable political party anymore, you guys keep losing, then your voice, my voice, we will have a lot more say when the value system changes. We also have to have the biggest publications in progressive media don't give a damn about war. And they don't give a damn they only care if it's Trump, but they don't care if it's Obama and Clinton wreaking havoc on the world. So I think there's a value system that has to change. If that value system changes and you see, progressives or publications that are very big actually battling the DNC, actually, when the Democratic Party or the DNC actually is against a progressive publication, that'll be good. That'll help us kind of wean ourselves away from this whole empire thing, because you need an opposition to perpetual war. Unfortunately, we don't have that. So.
Well, you're right about that. And I know you've got to get going here, so I appreciate your time. And I'm going to invite you back again sometime as 2020 approaches, because you said some pretty provocative statements and made some provocative claims. And I want to challenge you on those, or reinforce them perhaps sometime when you have more time. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate it.
Well, Victor, thank you for everything, and it was a great time. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Revolt Against Plutocracy won't just be covering the news about the necessary revolution in the United States. Sometimes we'll be making the news. If you want to stay on top of the revolutionary actions and strategies of grassroots, genuine progressives, and our allies, please subscribe to our YouTube channel today.